HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Landscapes of Science and Religion. What are we disagreeing about? By Nick Spencer and Hannah Waite. Read by Liam Gerrard. Unless we get inside the language games, paradigms of the respective traditions, and this necessarily requires their construction as concrete historical practices, rather than as abstract philosophical traditions, the resulting conflict or consonance between science and religion will be a contrived artifact of the tools of analysis and translation. John Milbank and Peter Harrison, editors. After Science and Religion. If you are going to disagree with your adversary in a debate in the public square, I want you to disagree with them for the right reason. John Evans, Morals, Not Knowledge, recasting the contemporary US conflict between religion and science. You recognize, I hope, the existence of spiritual interests in your patients. Certainly I do, but those words are apt to cover different meanings to different minds. Mr. Bulstrode and Dr. Lydgate in conversation. George Eliot, Middlemarch. 1. Introduction. The Landscapes of Science and Religion. Science and Religion. The relationship that will not die. The relationship between science and religion is of seemingly endless fascination. At the time of drafting this opening paragraph, a Google News search for the two terms revealed recent stories about how an important paper in the scientific journal Nature on the relationship between moralizing gods and the evolution of complex societies had been retracted. How the recently deceased cosmologist and Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg had been famed for saying that science had proven the universe to be pointless, and that science and religion have nothing constructive to say to one another. How, by using data sets from patients with brain lesions, researchers had managed to trace locations associated with spiritual and religious belief to a specific human brain circuit, and how Orthodox priests in Greece were leading the charge against COVID vaccinations, to name only 4. The interest goes beyond these transient media stories. The language of the divine, the God equation, the mind of God, the serpent's promise, is often appropriated for popular science books, while the trope of scientific evidence, proof of heaven, a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife, the language of God, a scientist presents evidence for belief, finding God in the waves, how I lost my faith and found it again through science, is deployed for religious ends. According to Google Ngram Viewer, mention of science and religion in books has risen constantly since the mid-1970s, except for a brief fall after a peak in 2006-7, since when it has been recovered. It now stands at an unprecedentedly high level. This breadth of interest is not, of course, burdened by any consensus. Indeed, the debate around science and religion is notorious not only for its persistence and popularity, but also for the strength of the differing opinions it attracts. Conflict, concord, and consilience are all expressed with confidence that commonly spills over into hubris. Jerry Coyne, Eve Gingras, Richard Dawkins, and Victor Stenger, among others, have shown themselves to be forceful, articulate, and popular advocates for the view either that science has disproven God, or that science and religion are engaged in an impossible dialogue, or that they are straightforwardly incompatible. Alistair McGrath, Francis Collins, John Polkinghorne, Tom McLeish, and Celia Dean Drummond, among others, have argued for a more compatibilist, indeed harmonious and mutually productive relationship between the two. In contrast to both these positions, Stephen Jay Gould advocated the principle of non-overlapping magisteria, NOMA, in the sense that science dealt with the empirical realm and religion with that of meaning and value, the two thereby existing in harmony, purchased at the expense of any interaction. More recently, The psychiatrist and intellectual historian Ian McGilchrist has built on his analysis of the hemispheric nature of the brain to develop a sophisticated approach of scientific and religious understandings of reality, an approach best categorized as complementary rather than conflictual, concordant, or non-overlapping. In the light of these differing views, only a handful of which have been mentioned here, and the ongoing public interest in science and religion, scholars have attempted to delineate a typology of the various positions held. Perhaps the best known of these is the fourfold categorization proposed by Ian Barber in When Science Meets Religion, according to which science and religion can be in conflict, independent of one another, in dialogue, or fully integrated. The American theologian John Hort has already suggested a similar, if more alliterative typology of conflict, contrast, contact, and confirmation. In an article on conflict and compatibility, theologian Ian McFarland developed Barber's four categories by delineating two different approaches to compatibility and to integration between science and religion. In an important, if somewhat neglected book on how to relate science and religion, philosopher Michael Stenmark outlined four different levels or dimensions of science and religion. Others have multiplied categories. Arguing that science and religion interact at so many different junctures and in so many different ways that any simple generalization is misleading, Ted Peters put forward no fewer than 10 conceptual models for relating the two. In the light of this profusion of positions and typologies, it is no surprise that sociologists John and Michael Evans have claimed that the field of religion and science is one of the muddiest in all of sociology. One reason for this, they claim, lies in the long-running academic assumption that religion and science always conflict, and that they conflict over competing truth claims about the world. This might well be true, but it is the contention of this book that the problem lies deeper still. The four news items cited in the opening paragraph of this section illustrate the issue. Under the general rubric of science and religion, these stories cover questions of human evolution, civilizational development, morality, purpose, neuroscience, spiritual belief and experiences, public health, political action, and religious activism. This is a mixed bag by anyone's reckoning, and it underlines how speaking of science or religion in clearly delineated terms is extremely difficult, and speaking of science and religion in such terms even more so. In essence, many of the debates around science and religion remain mired in essentialist concepts of the two entities, the conviction that there is such a thing as science and such a thing as religion, and that the two can be meaningfully compared with one another. Without addressing this definitional problem, we will make little progress in clarifying, let alone settling this debate. To have a compelling view of the relationship between science and religion, we must first tackle the difficult issue of what exactly we are being asked to relate to one another. What, in other words, are we even talking about? In doing this, we can learn from history. The shifting territories of science and religion. For over 30 years, historians have been dismantling the simplistic narrative of a relentless and long-standing conflict, or warfare, between science and religion. First outlined in detail in the final decades of the 19th century, in the work of John William Draper and Andrew Dickson Waite, and then popularized by Edward Humans in his Popular Science magazine, the metaphor of conflict retains significant power in the popular imagination today. Dating from the publication of either God and Nature, a volume of essays edited by David Lindbergh and Ronald Numbers in 1986, or John Hedley Brooks' Science and Religion, Some Historical Perspectives in 1991, a new movement in historical scholarship, exemplified by the work of Lindbergh, Numbers and Brooke, as well as that of Peter Harrison, Bernard Lightman, Geoffrey Cantor, and Edward J. Larson, among others, has successfully overturned the exhausted historical conflict narrative within academic circles. Historians, most recently James Ungaranu, now study Draper and Waite themselves, rather than the history they purported to reveal, in order to trace the origins of the conflict narrative. For all its success, however, this scholarship has been less successful, either in offering an alternative controlling metaphor with which to replace Draper and Waite's conflict and warfare, or in changing wider public or elite opinion. As the 2018 volume of essays on The Warfare Between Science and Religion, The Idea That Wouldn't Die, put it, notwithstanding all the outstanding work by a generation of historians dismantling the conflict model, their revisionist accounts have scarcely made a dent on leading public intellectuals. These 2 points, the failure of contemporary scholarship to come up with a new controlling metaphor to describe the historic and contemporary relationship between science and religion, and the ongoing power of the conflict metaphor in the public imagination, are almost certainly linked. What the warfare narrative lacked in historical nuance or balance, it made up for in clarity and memorability. The most widely discussed replacement for conflict is complexity, an idea most associated with Brooks' Science and Religion, although present also in God and Nature. The problem, however, is that, in stark contrast with the Draper-Waite warfare metaphor, this complexifying history, in Numbers' phrase, seems to have little to recommend it beside its truth. As Brooke himself has written, complexity is a historical reality, not a thesis, still less a controlling metaphor. Over recent years, there have been various attempts to resolve, or at least to address this problem, by capturing the nuance and subtlety of the historical relationship between science and religion, without altogether abandoning any attempts to draw conceptual clarity between the two. Thus, in his essay on simplifying complexity, in the Festschrift volume Science and Religion, New Historical Perspectives, Numbers outlined 5 mid-scale patterns of naturalization, privatization, secularization, globalization, and radicalization, which, while in no way attempting to resurrect an uncomplicated master narrative, sought to establish identifiable sub-narratives amidst the complexified rubble of the ruined warfare narrative. More recently, Bernie Lightman edited a volume of essays on rethinking history, science and religion, which evaluates the use of complexity as a heuristic principle by paying particular attention to spaces, geographical and media, in which the relationship between science and religion has been mediated. Understanding science and religion spatially is one possible way of maintaining complexity with a measure of conceptual clarity. In this vein, and most influentially, Peter Harrison has sought to combine the reality of historical nuance and complexity within a coherent and instructive spatial framework through his influential metaphor of territories. Initially, his 2006 essay on constructing the boundaries between science and religion, and then, more substantially, in his 2015 book, The Territories of Science and Religion, Harrison brought considerable historical scholarship to bear on the argument that intellectual territories, like national ones, shift over time, and that it is only by paying attention to those changes that the historical relationship between entities like science and religion can be determined. Neither science nor religion is self-evident or a natural category. On the contrary, both are socially constructed and have shifted considerably in their meaning over the years. Natural philosophy was, in the ancient Mediterranean world, the study of the natural world as a means to achieving the good life. Mathematics and physics were similarly ethical religious activities, particularly according to Neoplatonic understanding. Scientia, in the Middle Ages, was a mental habit oriented to the acquisition of knowledge through the rehearsal of logical demonstrations. Scientiae were the different bodies of knowledge derived from the exercise of this habit. Over time, such diverse virtues, practices, and bodies of knowledge coalesced into an allegedly unitary method, supposedly free of any metaphysical or existential baggage, by means of which nature, another constructed and contested concept, could be successfully interrogated. It was a similar story for religion. Religio was once the scholastic virtue of inner piety, and was transformed, via the confessionalization of Europe and the European encounter with other global cultures, into a set of purportedly coherent and formalized beliefs, doctrines and practices, through the lens of which, first Christian denominations, and then world religions, were identified and essentialized. Historically, religion has as much or as little coherence or constancy as science. In this way, any straightforward relationship between science and religion in any period before the mid-19th century, whether conflictual or harmonious, would have been inaccurate to the point of meaningless. Harrison's territorial metaphor has significant potential. Recognizing the changing nature of, and borders between, these intellectual territories helps rescue the historical interpretation of science and religion from the Scylla of simplicity and the Charybdis of confusing complexity. Territories is a perceptive and useful metaphor for understanding the relationship between science and religion. The concept of intellectual cartography is not, of course, a new one, and it has been deployed before in this field. The philosopher Mary Midgley, for example, drew on the idea of intellectual maps in her attempt to end the apartheid of mind and body separation. However, Harrison's sustained and highly evidenced essay has breathed fresh life into metaphorical cartography as a coherent, yet flexible model by means of which the relationship between science and religion may be understood. Territories and the path away from essentialism. Harrison's analysis is historic and ends in the later 19th century, when recognizably modern definitions of science and religion had been established. However, that is not the end of the story. Just as there is breadth and fluidity to the historical concepts of science and of religion, as Harrison has shown, so there is to contemporary definitions of the words, no matter how confidently we use them today. Current debates around science and religion are as afflicted by terminological confusion, and, in particular, unwarranted essentialism as historical accounts have been. According to such essentializing logic, religion and science today are clearly and objectively demarcated entities, or at least sufficiently so for the relationship between them to be described with confidence. Such an approach seems to be a prerequisite for any strongly conflictual understandings of the relationship between the two. To prove that science and religion are at war, it is crucial to demonstrate that each is a coherent, identifiable, and clearly structured entity, ideally something that is defined precisely against the other. In Steven Pinker's words, anyone who engages in secular reason is a kind of honorary scientist. I define science in the broadest term of relying on logic and evidence, rather than on dogma or authority or subjective feeling. That said, essentialism need not lead to conflict. Stephen Jay Gould's concept of science and religion as non-overlapping magisteria depends on equally essentialist premises, while proposing a far more ameliorative relationship between the two than is afforded in the work of Dawkins, Coyne, or Pinker. Gould believed that the magisterium of science covered the empirical realm, what the universe is made of, fact, and why does it work this way, theory, whereas the magisterium of religion extended over questions of ultimate meaning and moral value. His two magisteria exist as coherent bodies of thought, but are wholly distinct from, rather than antagonistic towards, one another. Moreover, an essentialist approach to the relationship between science and religion need not arrive at any single model of relationship between them, whether conflictual or non-overlapping. Indeed, the very task of developing a typology of science and religion, such as those of Barber, Hort, and Peters mentioned, implicitly draws on essentialist ideas of science and religion. The problem, therefore, is not that an essentialist understanding of science and religion leads necessarily to antagonism, to harmony, or to any particular relationship between the two. It is more simply that such an understanding is ultimately intellectually and sociologically indefensible. Science and religion are not single, coherent entities today any more than they were over history. This is increasingly recognized in the scholarship on the interaction between the two. In his article, Whose Science and Whose Religion?, Stuart Glennon contended that those arguments about the relationship between science and religion that proceed on the basis of identifying a set of essential characteristics of scientific and religious worldviews are doomed to failure, because science, to some extent, and religion, to a much larger extent, are cultural phenomena that are too diverse in their expressions to be characterized in terms of a unified worldview. McGrath has explained how attempts to define science and religion invariably founder on the now widespread recognition that both are theoretical constructs, shaped by cultural perceptions and agendas, in a way that severely impedes any attempt to offer essentialist accounts of their nature, or their possible interactions. Joseph Baker, writing on public perceptions of incompatibility between science and religion, has said that any perceived relationship between science and religion is necessarily socially constructed and marked by perceptions that are pragmatic, heuristic, and vary depending on how individuals engage both institutions, rather than being indicative of an inherent relationship between the two. Jonathan Young has argued that religion and non-religion are fuzzy categories, comprising a loose collection of causally and phenomenologically distinct phenomena, such as belief in supernatural agents, participation in rituals, formation of non-kin groups, and obedience to moral codes, and as such, they have no legitimate scientific use. In short, for all that the territories of science and religion may have settled down after centuries of fluctuation and dispute, they remain unclear, disputable, and socially constructed. Unlike political territories, at least of the modern era, there is no sovereign political authority to determine where the boundaries lie. Disaggregating science and religion. This challenge is not unique to the discourse around the relationship between science and religion. Indeed, it is particularly live and acute in political and legal theory, which wrestles with the intractable question of how states should legislate and how courts should adjudicate on issues of the freedom of speech, dress, association, organization, and governance of religious groups, while maintaining just and reasonable equivalence with non-religious worldviews. Faced with this complex and ambiguous understanding of religion in legal and political thought, Cécile Laborde, professor of political theory at the University of Oxford, has, in her recent book, Liberalism's Religion, suggested a way forward that navigates the problem of the socially constructed nature of religion by disaggregating religion into identifiable elements or dimensions. On the premise that there is no stable, universally valid empirical referent for the category of religion, she argues that political theorists should disaggregate religion into a plurality of relevant normative dimensions as a way of developing a more robust and equitable theory of liberal egalitarianism. This enables her to dispense with the Western, Christian-inflected construal of religion on which liberal political theory has historically relied, the development of which Harrison traces in Territories, and to go beyond the imprecision of the loose analogue of conception of the good that John Rawls popularized in Anglo-American analytical political philosophy. The resulting disaggregated dimensions of religion include a cognitive dimension, in which religiosity is predicated on certain specific beliefs about God and the nature of humans, an identificatory or symbolic dimension, in which certain texts, symbols, aspects of dress, etc., denote religious identity and belonging, an ethical dimension, in which the religious hold moral commitments that inform their conscience and structure and orient their moral lives, a community dimension, in which religiosity is expressed through patterns of collective worship and organization, and a public dimension, in which religious commitment is manifest in modes of association from the formal and personal, like marriage, to the informal and communal, like voluntary social action, each of which, in different ways, contributes to the wider public good. By Laborde's reasoning, it is only by disaggregating religion in this way, and by identifying corresponding dimensions with similar elements of non-religiosity, personal beliefs and experiences, secular conscience, associations, comprehensive worldviews, etc., that liberal egalitarianism can hope to treat religion with the justice and fairness that it claims. Although not without criticism, Laborde's approach to religion has been well received, and although it may at first seem as if science doesn't lend itself to the same approach, Lennon, for example, claimed that science is only to some extent a cultural phenomenon, there is in fact similar potential and need for disaggregation here. Although arguably less socially constructed than religion, science is still a broad, fuzzy, constructed, and contestable category that is in need of disaggregation if we are to talk about its relationship with religion. Such a disaggregative approach has already been ventured, albeit in an ad hoc way, in several rather different approaches within the discourse of science and religion. Alvin Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, Science, Religion, and Naturalism, argues that simply talking of science and/or versus religion makes little sense, as it misses the crucial details. He contends that the true relationship between science and religion is a mixture of concord and conflict, depending on which dimensions of science or religion are under scrutiny. By Plantinga's reckoning, there is superficial conflict but deep concord between science and theistic religion, but superficial concord and deep conflict between science and the naturalism that many scientists believe is necessary to science. More precisely, there are some areas of only apparent conflict. He cites evolution and miracles. Somewhere there is real but superficial conflict, such as evolutionary psychology. Some where there is deep concord, such as the apparent fine-tuning of the universe, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, or the remarkably effective match between human cognitive powers and the wider world. And some where there is deep and serious conflict, though he argues that this is not between religion and science, but between religion and scientific naturalism. The relationship between science and religion is thus complexified according to the dimensions that emerge from the disaggregation of each. In a similar vein, John Evans, professor of sociology at University of California, UC, San Diego, in his 2018 book, Morals Not Knowledge, Recasting the Contemporary U.S. Conflict Between Religion and Science, also seeks to dislodge the idea that there is a foundational conflict between science and religion in public by emphasizing the locatedness of interaction, and stressing how science and religion discourse is conducted by people who are always specifically located and shaped by particular concerns and objectives, rather than in the abstract. Evans teases apart elite discourse on science and religion, with its focus on epistemology and the nature of reality, from popular discourse, which has a much greater interest in existential, ethical, and in particular, medical dimensions. The nature of the interaction between science and religion is predicated on whether it is located at the elite level of truth claims or the popular level of moral or existential claims. A similar point is made by Stephen T. Asma with regard to the affective dimension of religion, which is all too often ignored in science and religion discourse. More recently, Fern Elsdon Baker and colleagues in the Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum project have drawn out of their research the social and cultural factors that drive the narrative, and in particular the conflict narrative, between science and religion. They have shown how both religion and science act as a facet of social or cultural identity, and while no one would have thought otherwise of religion, the way in which Elsdon Baker et al. Have shown how enthusiastic promotion of science, and especially evolution, can serve as an important role in the expression of atheistic.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?